Hello, students. Well, with this rather brief lecture, we'll bring to an end the story of the Cold War and this course. The end of the Cold War was really brought out, in a sense, primarily by two men. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet premier from 1985 to 1991, and President Ronald Reagan, who was in office from 1981 to 1989. And you see in this photograph that President Ronald Reagan gave his own very famous speech at the Berlin Wall, in which he uttered the words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So before we talk about this confrontation between these two men, let's learn a little bit about Mikhail Gorbachev and who he was. Well, when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he was very aware of the deficiencies of the Soviet system, the failures of the economy, the inability of the system to provide for the basic needs of its people, and the growing discontent of people with the lack of personal freedom and political participation. But Gorbachev was a communist. He did believe in Marxist-Leninist ideology, and essentially his goal became to save the communist system by introducing elements of liberalism, that is, of Western-style freedoms, to build these in just enough to release some of the tension that was wrecking the system and to make sure that communism would continue to exist in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev had two main slogans. The first was perestroika, and group 2, you'll have a reading by Mikhail Gorbachev on perestroika. This word in English means restructuring. Essentially, Gorbachev wanted to reorganize the Soviet system, first of all, so that there would be more individual initiative in terms of the economy. He understood that the system of collective farms created by Stalin was reducing agricultural productivity, and the flat structure of wages was also not giving people an incentive to go above and beyond, to work harder. And so Gorbachev really wanted to encourage more individual initiative and to make a space within the Soviet economic system for free enterprise. Also, he wanted to allow much greater freedom of speech and to especially allow ordinary people to have more participation in decisions, which, of course, had previously been made entirely by insiders within the Communist Party. And that connected to his second slogan, Glasnost, which means openness. So this was really going to be a breath of fresh air for the Soviet system, according to Gorbachev and his backers, that they would be more open, more free in a sense, more open to participation, but they hoped that this would save communism by giving Soviet citizens more of a stake in the system. As a matter of fact, it had the opposite effect, because once Gorbachev removed the lid of repression that had been terrorizing the Soviet citizens ever since the days of Lenin, that is, once he instituted Glasnost and people began to speak their minds, they simply demanded more and more freedom, and ultimately the destruction of communism itself. So essentially Gorbachev gave the people an inch and they took a mile. Gorbachev was one of those leaders who was actually much more popular in the United States than he ever was in his own country. The other protagonist in this head-to-head dispute at the end of the Cold War was, of course, President Ronald Reagan, who was really a Cold Warrior, and he was determined to win the Cold War. Group 3, you'll have a speech that President Reagan gave to the British Parliament in 1982, in which he expressed in the strongest terms his desire to see communism on the ash heap of history. That is, dead and buried, and the free world triumphant. In one of his radio addresses, President Reagan once referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. And that phrase really stuck. So President Reagan was very strongly anti-communist, and he did meet with Premier Gorbachev a few times, and some negotiations took place for the elimination of certain types of nuclear weapons. But Reagan's fundamental strategy was to defeat the Soviet Union by essentially bankrupting them. Reagan really escalated the nuclear arms race, began ramping up United States defense spending to a very large degree, because he knew that if the Soviets tried to keep up with this increase of defense spending, that it would wreck their economy, and that it might result in a revolution within the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism. And in a sense, the straw that broke the camel's back in this connection was a program that President Reagan announced in 1983 called SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as the Star Wars program. Why? Because this was a super space age concept. Essentially, it involved mounting laser beams on satellites and firing them at nuclear missiles that the Soviets might launch at us, and thus creating a nuclear missile defense shield, which would prevent the Soviets from attacking us, and would ultimately provide the ultimate defense for the American Republic and win the Cold War. Well, this program was never successfully implemented, but the sheer mention of it threw the Soviets into a panic. And they struggled to develop their own version of SDI. This, of course, started even before Gorbachev became the premier, but he was saddled with this effort to keep up with the United States in terms of these new military programs, and ultimately the Soviets were not able to do that. Now, of course, Reagan's strategy to win the Cold War came at a cost for the American taxpayer. Actually, it's rather surprising. Reagan ran as a fiscal conservative, and he was a Republican, but it was actually President Reagan who started the modern trend of racking up large budget deficits. His predecessor, the Democratic President Jimmy Carter, had much lower deficits, but President Reagan really ran up huge deficits in his attempt to win the Cold War. Was it worth it? Well, if you ask Eastern Europeans to this day, they will say yes. They view President Ronald Reagan as a hero. Because under the tension of competition with the United States during the 1980s, the Soviet Union began to crack and slowly to relinquish its control over its puppet states within the Soviet bloc. This happened in Poland, it happened in Hungary, and gradually East European nations, through what were called the Velvet Revolutions of 1989. They were called that because no shots were fired. These were peaceful, nonviolent revolutions in which the people simply poured out into the streets and demanded an end to communism. The most famous moment, of course, of these Velvet Revolutions was the night when the East German government was finally forced to open the Berlin Wall, and people came pouring through from East Berlin to West Berlin, and then the people themselves took whatever they had at hand, hammers, pickaxes, whatever they could find, and the people demolished that hateful symbol of the Cold War themselves. And I'll never forget seeing that. If you grew up with the Berlin Wall as a symbol of what was wrong with the world during the Cold War, it was really a tremendous moment of hope and optimism to see the people of Germany tearing down that wall and ultimately reuniting their country. So the Cold War officially ended, you could say, in 1991. the communist regime did hang on in the Soviet Union until 1991, when a coup dislodged Gorbachev from power, and the Soviet Union split up into smaller independent republics, with the largest, of course, being Russia. I want to mention another important communist nation that perhaps was much more successful in implementing perestroika, you could say, than Mikhail Gorbachev was himself, and that was the People's Republic of China. Now, after the death of Mao Zedong, another leader emerged in China beginning in 1978, a man named Deng Xiaoping. And as Gorbachev would later, Deng was very aware of the economic problems caused by communism, and so he decided that he wanted to make China into essentially a Western free enterprise system, but still ruled by the Communist Party. He called this socialism with Chinese characteristics. In other words, essentially you would have a capitalist economy and a one-party dictatorial state. And so far, this seems to have been very successful in the People's Republic of China for the Communist Party. China has become the world's second largest economy, the United States' largest trading partner, and the communist regime is still in control and shows no signs of letting go of power. So if Deng Xiaoping instituted perestroika, he definitely did not institute glasnost. And that was brought home to the world also in 1989, while the Velvet Revolutions were going on in Europe. Students poured out into the streets of various Chinese cities to demand democratic reforms. This democracy movement was triggered when a Communist Party official named Hu Yaobang died. Hu was widely viewed as a friend to reform, democratic reforms, and so students were upset by his death. And especially in Beijing, students set up an encampment in the main public square in Beijing, Tiananmen Square, to demand democracy in China. And their theme song was Beethoven's Great Ninth Symphony, the Ode to Joy. And they built a statue, which you see here in paper mache, that they called the Goddess of Democracy. But if you look carefully, of course, what does it look like? The Statue of Liberty. So at a time when Americans and many other Westerners had become cynical about the possibilities of modern democracy, you see that our national symbols still could be very powerful for students in another faraway country that were fighting for freedom. But the communist rulers were alarmed by the student protests. They were determined to hold on to power. And on the evening of June 4th, the tanks rolled in. And hundreds and hundreds of people were killed, mostly in the streets leading into Tiananmen Square as sympathetic citizens of Beijing tried to stop the tanks. But when the tanks got to the square, the students held a meeting and decided to vacate the square, and then their revolution was at an end. And China is not a democracy still, and there is still a great deal of repression. When I was teaching at St. Louis University, I had several students from the People's Republic of China in my class when we were talking about this, and I asked them if they even knew about this incident, the June 4th incident in 1989, and one by one they all said that they had heard vaguely of it, but that no one was allowed to talk about it, because of course the internet is censored in China, and the government still has full control of information. But in spite of that, the student uprising really did inspire many people like myself throughout the world. And this iconic image that I want to leave you with symbolized that inspiration. This was taken a couple days after the student uprising was crushed on June 4th, and the tanks were still in the streets and the soldiers were mopping things up in Beijing, when suddenly an ordinary Chinese citizen who was coming home with his groceries just got fed up, and he ran out in the street and stood in front of this line of tanks, defying them to run him over. And he stood there for several minutes, and the tanks could not move. So this one individual man really stared the power of the communist regime in the face, and for a few minutes won a victory there in Beijing. He became known as Tank Man, and this image became iconic throughout the world. So perhaps as we finish the story of this course and of the 20th century, we can take heart that perhaps in spite of tyrannies on the right and left, fascism, communism, totalitarian regimes, the rise of what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex, and the terrifying threat of nuclear war, that the individual human will and heart still had a role to play in the political life of this planet. And before we go, I just want to address one issue. Sometimes I think students are frustrated because I end the course here with the end of the Cold War, because obviously so many very important things have happened since the end of the Cold War in 1991. 9/11 and the War on Terror and the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, so many things. But I consider that that phase of our world's history is still going on, and in fact is still being written by you as citizens of this country and as citizens of the world. So when hopefully you all have written a happy ending to this phase of world history, I will incorporate it into my courses, but until then, we'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much.